My daughter and son-in-law had been living rent-free in my manor on an 82-acre estate for 14 months. At Thanksgiving dinner, my son-in-law's father raised his glass and declared, "To our $8.6 million future." Then my daughter slid a signature page toward me. "It's symbolic, Dad. Just sign it." They watched me pick up the pen, certain I had finally surrendered. But I set it down and looked around the table. "Before I sign anything, every investor here needs to open the memorandum to page 17. Before we go further, thank you for being here. It means everything to me. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, your city, your country? I want to know. Welcome to Dad Family Revenge." A quick note. This story contains fictional elements crafted for entertainment and education. Names and settings are coincidental, but the lesson inside is worth keeping. The morning I realized something was wrong had nothing to do with Derek's announcement. It had nothing to do with the phone call that came later that night, or the paperwork I would spend the next week untangling with my attorney. It had to do with a chair. Eleanor's chair, the wide-armed wingback she had reupholstered in sage green the year we finished the east wing, was sitting on the back porch in the November rain. I was up on a ladder fixing the bedroom window frame when I looked down and saw it there, pressed against the porch railing with water darkening the fabric along the armrests. My chest tightened the way it does when you reach for something familiar and your hand closes on empty air. I gripped the ladder rung and looked at that chair for a long time. It had not been moved this morning. I understood that with a cold, settling certainty. The water stains on the cushion were not fresh. That chair had been out there for at least 2 weeks, sitting in the rain while I walked past the back window every single day, and somehow never let myself see it. That was the moment I understood how far things had gone. My name is Walter Bennett. I am 68 years old, a retired architect, and for 28 years I designed and built Stonehaven with my own hands alongside my wife Eleanor. 82 acres in Westchester County, New York, a substantial stone manor at the top of a hill with a row of old oak trees lining the gravel drive and a small pond behind the property that freezes at the edges every December. 3 years ago, Eleanor died of pancreatic cancer in the upstairs bedroom where we had slept for 25 years. After she was gone, the house became something I did not have a word for. Not empty emptiness implies a space that was once filled. Stonehaven felt like it was holding its breath. So when my daughter Rachel asked if she and her husband Derek could move in for a while, I said yes. That was 14 months ago. I climbed down the ladder, carried Eleanor's chair back inside, and set it in its place by the reading window. I pressed my palm flat against the damp fabric, the way you press your hand to someone's forehead, to check for fever, knowing already what you are going to find. Derek appeared in the doorway. 42 years old, broad-shouldered, with the easy confidence of a man who had decided in advance that whatever was about to happen was not a problem. "Thanksgiving's coming up," he said. "Rachel and I have been planning a gathering. 22 people. We figured Stonehaven was the perfect place." He paused. "We thought you might be more comfortable out in the stone house for a few nights. Give everyone some breathing room." I stared at him. "You want me to sleep in the workshop?" "It's not a workshop anymore. Rachel had it cleared out." He said it like this was a favor. "Just a few nights, Walter. Don't make this difficult." Something moved through my blood that was not anger. Something steadier. Something that knew it needed to last longer than one afternoon. I went to my study without answering him. I pulled open the third drawer on the left and took out the original land deed for Stonehaven dated 1987. The paper was soft at the folds. I set it on the desk and pressed my hand flat on top of it. Then my phone rang. "Mr. Bennett. This is Carol Simmons from Valley Trust Bank. I'm calling to verify information related to an entity called Stonehaven Ridge Hospitality, LLC. My hand pressed harder against the deed. Miss Simmons, I said slowly. I have never heard that name in my life. Carol Simmons from Valley Trust did not give me much. Bank employees are trained to confirm without revealing, to ask without explaining, and she was very good at her job. But she gave me enough. The LLC in question has listed Stonehaven as the primary asset in a development financing application. She said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone reading from a script she had not written. We're in the verification stage. Standard procedure requires us to confirm that all listed principals are aware of and have consented to the use of their assets. My hand tightened around the phone until I could feel the edge of the case pressing into my palm. Mrs. Simmons, I want to be very clear with you. I have not consented to anything. I have never spoken to anyone from your bank. And I have never heard of Stonehaven Ridge Hospitality LLC before this phone call. A pause. The kind of pause that means the person on the other end is writing something down. I understand, Mr. Bennett. I'm going to flag this account for internal review. Is there an attorney we can direct further correspondence to? Margaret Shaw, I said. Shaw Law, White Plains. She has handled my estate and property matters for 20 years. Thank you. We'll be in touch with her office. The call lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. I know because I checked my phone after I hung up, standing in the middle of my study, with the land deed still spread open on the desk, and the sound of Derek laughing at something in the kitchen drifting up through the floorboards. I called Maggie at 9:47 that night. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she had been awake. Maggie Shaw did not go to bed early on evenings when there was something unresolved in her files, and I had left a short message with her assistant that afternoon that said, "Only call me when you can, it's about Stonehaven. Walter." Her voice was the same as it had been for 20 years, direct, unhurried, with the slight formality she kept, even with people she trusted completely. Tell me. So I told her. The phone call from Valley Trust. The name of the LLC. The financing application. Carol Simmons flagging the account. I told her all of it in the order it had happened, the way she had taught me to relay information. Over 2 decades of working together, facts, first, feelings, later. When I finished, Maggie was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. I had learned to count her silences. 3 seconds meant she was thinking. Longer than 5 meant she was concerned. I'm going to pull whatever's publicly available tonight, she said. Delaware LLC registrations are accessible. If they filed in Delaware, I can have the formation documents before midnight. A pause. Walter, are Rachel and Derek in the house right now? 20 feet below me. Don't say anything to them tonight. Don't change your behavior. Don't look at Derek differently at breakfast. Can you do that? My jaw tightened so hard I felt it in my back teeth. Yes. I'll be there at 6 tomorrow morning, before anyone else is up. She paused again. Get some sleep if you can. I did not sleep. I sat in the chair by the window in my bedroom, not Eleanor's chair, mine the plain wooden one I had pulled from the workshop years ago because Eleanor said it was too ugly for anywhere else in the house, and I looked at the photograph on the nightstand. Eleanor and I on the day we poured the foundation for Stonehaven in the spring of 1987. She was wearing a flannel shirt and holding the architect's drawing I had made, laughing at something I had said that I could no longer remember. Her hair was dark then. Mine was too. We had been so certain of everything that morning. My chest ached with the particular weight of missing someone who would have known exactly what to do. Eleanor had always seen things before I did, people's motives, small shifts in behavior the moment a situation changed its nature. She would have noticed Derek's eyes moving over the property like an appraiser months ago. She would have seen the way Richard Collins walked through the rooms of Stonehaven, touching the door frames and running his hand along the mantelpiece the way a man touches things he is deciding whether to keep. I had seen it too. I had simply chosen not to name it. At 5:45 in the morning, I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. Headlights swept across the bedroom ceiling. I was already dressed. By the time I reached the front door, Maggie Shaw was walking up the porch steps in a dark wool coat, a leather satchel over one shoulder, and 2 cups of gas station coffee in her hands. She held one out to me without breaking stride. "The LLC was filed in Delaware 8 months ago," she said, stepping inside and moving directly toward the kitchen table the way she always did. Maggie never stood in doorways. She said doorways were for people who had not yet decided to come in. "Richard Collins is the registered agent. Derek Collins and Rachel Collins are listed as managing members." She set the satchel on the table and opened it. "Walter," she said, and the way she said my name made my stomach drop 4 floors. "I need you to sit down and look at what I found." Maggie opened the satchel and laid 3 documents on the kitchen table in the order she always arranged: evidence, chronological, left to right, nothing overlapping. The first was the Delaware LLC formation certificate for Stonehaven Ridge Hospitality, filed 8 months ago. Richard Collins, registered agent. Derek Collins and Rachel Collins, managing members. The second was a printout of the company website. Photographs of my house, my dining room, my back porch, the pond, the oak-lined drive laid out across the screen with warm, expensive lighting. At the top, in clean serif font, Stonehaven Ridge Hospitality. A premier destination experience in Westchester County, New York. The third document was a 2-page investor summary. At the bottom of the second page, above a signature line, was my name, Walter James Bennett, and beneath it, a signature, my signature. My hands started to shake, not the small tremor of a man surprised, but the deep, uncontrollable shaking of someone whose body understands something before his mind has finished processing it. I pressed both palms flat on the table. "That signature," I said, my voice lower than I intended. "That is not something I signed." "I know." Maggie's voice was steady because one of us needed to be. "Look at the date. The authorization letter was dated the 14th of August. Something shifted behind my eyes. "August 14th, I said. "I had a cortisone injection in my right hand that morning. Westchester Medical. Derek drove me. He sat in the waiting room the entire time." Something moved across Maggie's face, not surprise, but the expression of a lawyer who has just watched a case become significantly stronger. "We'll subpoena the hospital records this week." Maggie left before 7. By noon, 22 people had arrived in waves, minivans, rental SUVs, 1 truck that left tire marks across Eleanor's lawn. Richard Collins moved through the front hall with the easy authority of a man returning to a place he already considered his. By mid-afternoon, someone had used Eleanor's good china for a cheese plate without asking. Then Richard's nephew carried Eleanor's sage green wingback into the hallway to make room for a card table. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I had to set down my coffee mug. I walked to the hallway, lifted the chair myself, carried it back to the sitting room. "Walter?" Rachel appeared in the doorway. "What are you doing?" "Putting your mother's chair back." "It was in the way." "Then move something else." Linda Collins appeared behind Rachel, holding white wine, tilting her head with patient condescension. "Oh, Walter. It's just furniture, sweetheart." The word sweetheart landed wrong. Eleanor had called me that. Linda Collins had never once asked how I took my coffee. "It was my wife's," I said. Derek filled the end of the hallway, arms crossed, jaw set. "The stone house out back is ready, Walter. Just a few nights. Don't make 22 people rearrange their plans because one person can't adjust." Every conversation in earshot had stopped. I could feel 22 people waiting to see what the old man would do. I looked at Rachel. I said only her name. Just that. She straightened her shoulders. Her chin lifted slightly. And she said, I think Derek's right, Dad. You're ruining everything. My throat closed around whatever I might have said, and I was grateful for it. I walked to my study, locked the door, sat in the wooden chair and picked up my phone. Tom, I said when he answered. I need you to come to Stonehaven tonight. Bring whatever camera equipment you still have from your department days. Beyond the locked door, Derek was laughing at something in the hallway. Loud, comfortable, like a man who had already won. Someone has been in my study, I said. And I need to know what else they've been into. Maggie came back the next morning at 5:58. I knew because I had not slept, and had been watching the driveway from the sitting room window since 4:30, sitting in the wooden chair with a cold cup of coffee and the land deed from 1987 on the cushion beside me. When her headlights swept across the oak trees at the end of the drive, something in my chest loosened just slightly. The particular relief of knowing the person you are counting on has arrived. She was carrying the leather satchel and a hard-sided briefcase she used for documents she did not want to fold. That told me she had found more than what she showed me yesterday. I opened the door before she could knock. How much did you find? I said. Maggie set both bags on the kitchen table and looked at me with the direct, unhurried gaze she had used for 20 years whenever she was about to say something I needed to hear but would not enjoy. Sit down, Walter. I sat. The investor package was 41 pages of full private placement memorandum, the kind used to solicit investment from individuals in what the law calls a securities offering. At the top of the cover page in clean serif font, Stonehaven Ridge Hospitality, a private investment opportunity, target capitalization $8.6 million. My stomach dropped so hard I felt it in my knees. They have been raising money, I said. $1.1 million in escrow at Valley Trust, as of 2 days ago. Maggie turned past architectural renderings my house with additions I had never agreed, to a glass pavilion where Eleanor's rose garden stood and stopped at page 17. The text was dense, the kind lawyers write so non-lawyers will skip past it. But buried in the second paragraph was a sentence that made Maggie tap the page with one finger. I read it twice, then a third time. Ownership of Stonehaven remained solely vested in Walter James Bennett. Any transfer would be effective only upon Mr. Bennett's execution of a conforming transfer instrument, pursuant to New York Estates Powers and Trusts Law Section 7-1.17. I looked up at her. They put this in their own document. They thought it was buried deep enough that investors would not read it carefully. The corner of her mouth moved. They were right about the investors. They were not right about me. So without my signature, I said, they have nothing. Without your signature, the land never transfers. The financing collapses. She paused. But they have already spent investor money, Walter. That is a securities fraud issue under the New York Martin Act, regardless of whether the land ever changes hands. She pulled out a manila envelope, 2 documents side by side in a clear sleeve. The authorization letter with my forged signature, and the roofing contract I had signed in 2022. At first glance, identical. I leaned closer. There was a flaw in the way the W began a slight hesitation, creating a gap before the downstroke specific to a day when my right hand had been stiff from cold. The same gap appeared in both signatures. Not similar. The same. My throat tightened with something that was not anger and not grief, but lived in the territory between them. They copied it from the roofing contract. A forensic document examiner will confirm that in 4 days. Maggie folded her hands. Walter, has anyone in this house had access to your files? I thought of Richard Collins asking me in September how I organized my property documents. He had framed it as admiration. I had laughed and told him everything was in the third drawer on the left. My hands curled against the table. Richard asked where I kept my contracts. I told him. Maggie wrote on her legal pad. Tom installed the cameras last night. He was here until midnight. Good. Don't lock the drawer. Don't move anything. Let them believe they still have access. She stood. If someone goes into that study, I want it on camera. Above us, a door opened. Footsteps crossed the ceiling. The house was waking up. On the porch, Maggie turned back once. Whatever you're feeling right now, put it somewhere you can find it later. You're going to need it. But not today. I watched her taillights disappear around the bend. Then I went back inside, past Richard's SUV, past the tire marks Derek's truck had left on Eleanor's lawn, into the house that had my name on the deed and other people's plans inside its walls. Tom Gallagher had been a Westchester County police officer for 31 years, and he had never once lost the habit of arriving early. When I opened the back door of the workshop at 7:15, he was already inside, sitting on an overturned crate with his laptop open on the workbench. A thermos of coffee beside him, and his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. "Close the door," he said, without looking up. I closed it. The workshop was cold, in the way stone buildings are cold in November. Not drafty, just dense, the kind of chill that lives in the walls and comes out slowly. Tom had set up 2 cameras the night before, one covering the hallway outside my study, one covering the interior from a high corner angle behind the old drafting shelf. "Sit down, Walter. I've been through the footage twice already." On the screen was a split view, 2 camera feeds time-stamped in the lower right corner. The hallway feed, the study feed. The third drawer on the left, exactly where I had told Richard it was. The timestamp read 11:59 p.m. "Watch the hallway feed," Tom said. At 12:18 in the morning, a figure appeared at the end of the corridor. He moved with the deliberate quiet of a man who believed he was alone, not sneaking, but careful. Dark robe over pajamas. Phone flashlight aimed at the floor. Richard Collins. He walked into my study at 12:18 in the morning, like he owned the place. Because in his mind, I understood he already did. My hands balled into fists on my knees so tightly that my knuckles went white, and I felt the pressure all the way up to my elbows. I made myself keep watching. On the study feed, Richard crossed to the desk in 11 steps. He did not try the first drawer or the second. He went directly to the third drawer on the left and pulled it open. He took out the roofing contract from 2022. Then he began photographing it page by page, slowly and methodically. The signature page, then the signature page again from a slightly different angle, making sure the detail was sharp. 11 minutes. Then he put the contract back, closed the drawer, and left. He knew exactly which drawer, Tom said. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look around. He went straight to it. I told him in September. The words came out like gravel. I thought he was making conversation. Tom took off his reading glasses and turned them slowly in his hands. "Walter." He planned that conversation. I stood up because I could not sit still with what was moving through me. Not anger only, something worse, the particular devastation of realizing that a conversation you remembered as pleasant had been for the other person a transaction. Through the kitchen window, I could see Linda Collins opening my cabinets, taking down my mugs. Normal as anything. "Already copied to an encrypted drive," Tom said, holding up a small black thumb drive. "One for Maggie. One stays with me. One goes in your safe deposit box." "Does this prove what I think it proves?" Tom put his glasses back on. "It proves Richard entered your study at 12:18 without your permission. It proves he went directly to a specific drawer and photographed a specific document." He paused. "But when you line this up next to the forged signature, the investor package, and the fact that Derek drove you to the hospital on the exact day that document was supposedly signed, you are not looking at a coincidence. You are looking at a plan. A plan." The word sat in the cold air like something with weight. I had spent 40 years designing buildings. I understood plans. I could look at a finished structure and read every intention behind it. I was looking at what they had built, and I could read every line of it. "I'm going back inside," I said. "And I'm going to smile at Richard Collins over the breakfast table and ask him how he slept." The corner of Tom's mouth moved. "Eleanor used to say you were the most patient man she ever met. I used to think that was a compliment." He picked up his thermos. "I'm starting to think it was a warning. Get the footage to Maggie, and Tom, don't tell anyone you were here." He raised the thermos in a small salute. "I was home all evening. Ask my dog." I walked back across the frost-stiffened grass toward the house, toward other people's coffee, and Richard Collins's voice carrying from the kitchen, easy and warm, and already I now understood, measuring everything he saw. "I found Sophie Collins in the workshop at 2:30 in the afternoon. She was sitting on the same overturned crate Tom had used that morning, knees pulled up to her chest, arms wrapped around her shins, staring at the far wall with the hollow look of someone who has been holding something too heavy for too long and has finally put it down just to rest, not because the weight is gone. She was 14 years old. Derek's daughter from his first marriage, with her father's dark hair and her mother's wide, still eyes, the kind that noticed things and filed them away without comment. She had been living at Stonehaven since September when her mother moved to Connecticut, and the custody arrangement shifted. In the months since she had become a quiet, reliable presence, the kind of child who wiped her shoes at the door without being asked, and never once touched anything that was not hers. I had liked her from the beginning. Eleanor would have loved her. "Sophie." I left the door open by me, the way you leave a door open when you want someone to know they can leave if they need to. "What are you doing out here?" Her eyes were dry, but the redness around them told me they had not always been. "I didn't know where else to go," she said. "The house is really loud." I pulled over a second crate and sat across from her. "You've been crying," I said. Not a question. Sophie's jaw tightened. Then she uncurled slightly, reached into her hoodie pocket, and pulled out a small piece of paper folded into quarters. She held it out to me without a word. I unfolded it carefully. A page torn from a spiral notebook. In her small, careful handwriting, 8 names. Some I recognized as people sitting in my living room right now. "Where did these come from?" I said. She pressed her lips together. Then she took a breath that shook on the way in. "Last month. I was doing homework on the back stairs by the linen closet. Dad didn't know I was there." She paused. Her hands gripped her knees until the knuckles went pale. "He was on the phone with Grandpa Richard. Dad said," she stopped, swallowed. "Dad said the old man won't see it coming. Rachel keeps him soft." The words landed in my chest, like something dropped from a height. I did not move. I did not let anything show on my face. "Then Grandpa Richard started saying names," Sophie continued. "People who had already put money in. He was going through them one by one." She nodded toward the paper. "I wrote them down because I didn't know what else to do. I didn't know if it mattered. I didn't know who to tell. She looked up at me, her eyes bright with the particular misery of a child carrying a grown-up secret in a body that was not built for it. "I like it here, Mr. Bennett," she said, and her voice cracked on the last word. "I don't want them to take your house." Something moved through me that I did not have a clean word for. Not the cold certainty I felt reading the investor documents. Not the fury of watching Richard on camera. Something older than both, the feeling of looking at a 14-year-old girl who had done the right thing alone in secret, with no guarantee it would matter, because her sense of fairness had overridden her sense of safety. Eleanor would have recognized that immediately. "You did the right thing," I said. "And you will not be without a safe place. Whatever happens between your father and me, you are not part of it." She nodded. Her throat moved. She pressed her lips together very firmly, and I looked away from her face, giving her a moment. Sophie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My mom used to say that." She did not repeat the words exactly, but I knew which ones she meant. I had heard them once already, in this same building on a cold afternoon 2 weeks ago, that had changed everything that came after it. I thought of Eleanor saying something very similar in this same building 20 years ago. "She sounds like she was wise," I said. "She was okay." Almost a smile. At the doorway, she turned back, looking younger than 14. "Mr. Bennett, are you scared?" I considered the question honestly. "No," I said. "But I'm sad. There's a difference." She held my gaze with those wide, still eyes. Then she walked back across the frost-stiffened grass toward the house, pulling her hoodie tighter. I waited until she was inside. Then I called Maggie. She picked up on the first ring. "Walter, I have 8 names," I said, "and I need you to tell me what to do with them." Diane Holt's office was on the 4th floor of a building on Main Street in White Plains, 7 minutes from the county courthouse, and 12 minutes from Stonehaven if you took the back roads. She had worked financial fraud investigations for 19 years, first with the State Attorney General's office, then as a private forensic accountant. Maggie had used her on 3 cases and described her the same way every time. She doesn't miss things. Diane did not stand when we entered. She was already at the conference table, laptop open, 3 printed spreadsheets arranged in front of her, with color-coded highlights, and a yellow legal pad covered in handwriting, so small it looked like someone had learned to compress everything down to its essential form. She was 44, lean, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck. "So, Mr. Bennett," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her, "sit down. I'm going to go in order, so please hold your questions until I finish each section." I sat. Maggie opened her own legal pad beside me. The total raised from 19 investors was $1,140,000 deposited into the Valley Trust escrow account over 6 months. The investor list matched 7 of the 8 names Sophie had written on her notebook paper. "Now," Diane said, "let's talk about where the money went." She turned the laptop to face us. A flow diagram, boxes connected by arrows, each labeled with a name, an amount, and a date. Derek Collins had drawn $90,000 from the escrow in 3 transfers between August and October, each labeled as an operational advance. The money went to a personal checking account at Chase Bank. From that account, Diane had traced payments to the Manhattan law firm that had represented Derek in the civil lawsuit that cost him his broker's license in 2021. He had been paying off the settlement in installments using investor money as his personal repayment plan. My jaw tightened. I pressed my back teeth together and breathed through my nose and said nothing. Richard Collins had received $80,000 coded as consulting fees. No contracts attached, no deliverables listed. As Diane put it in the flat, precise language of someone who dealt in facts rather than outrage, no documentation of any service having been rendered whatsoever. Brandon Collins had received $45,000 for marketing and digital presence. Then Diane turned to the third spreadsheet, and something in the way she paused made the muscles across my shoulders pull tight. Rachel Collins, she said, transferred $120,000 from the escrow account on September 3rd to a title company in Manhattan. She turned the laptop so I could see clearly. The title company was holding the funds as a deposit on a residential condominium purchase on West 79th Street on the Upper West Side. She paused. The purchaser is listed as Rachel Ann Collins individually, not the LLC, her personal name. The room felt like it tilted, not because I was surprised. I had known since Maggie first laid out the documents that Rachel was listed as a managing member. I had known since I read her email, "Dad won't fight us if we frame it as his legacy," that she had understood exactly what she was doing. But knowing something in the abstract is different from hearing a forensic accountant say your daughter's full name and the words individually and $120,000 in the same sentence. My chest felt like something had come loose from its moorings. I pressed my hand flat against the table to steady myself the same way I had pressed my palm against Eleanor's chair, against the land deed, against every surface that had needed to hold still when I could not. "Do you need a moment?" Diane asked. "No," I said. "Keep going." There was more. The 8 names from Sophie's list represented a second category of investor. Their money had gone to a separate business account at a bank in Paramus, New Jersey, registered under a Richard Collins entity. That account had received approximately $280,000 between April and June before the Valley Trust escrow was established. "Before the LLC was formally operational," Maggie said. "Correct. And Derek Collins's name does not appear on that account at all." I turned to Maggie. "Richard was collecting money before Derek knew. That's what the records suggest," she said, keeping her voice neutral in the way she kept it neutral when what she was thinking was worse than what she was saying. I looked at the flow diagram, all those boxes and arrows, all that careful movement of money that belonged to 19 people who had been told my name guaranteed their investment. My name. My land. My house that Eleanor and I had built one stone at a time over 28 years. "The Martin Act," I said. Diane nodded. "The Attorney General's office can bring a securities fraud action without proving intent to defraud. They only need to show that material misrepresentations were made in connection with the offer or sale of securities. What you have here is not a close call." I stood and buttoned my jacket. "Send everything to Maggie the moment your report is complete." She took off her glasses. "Mr. Bennett, the cases that hold together in court are the ones where someone kept their head long enough to let the evidence speak." She held my gaze. "Keep your head." Outside, the November sky was flat gray. Maggie walked beside me to the parking structure where the wind came through from the east and smelled like rain. "When we go back to that house tonight," Maggie said, "you cannot let Rachel see anything different in your face." I pulled my keys from my pocket. "I've been doing it for a week already," I said. "One more day won't break me." Before I reveal what Walter does next, comment Stonehaven below so I know you're still with me on Revenge, Dad. Because what happens at that dinner table is something none of them saw coming. A note: the story you're hearing contains fictional elements and may not reflect any specific events. If this isn't the content for you, feel free to step away and find something that fits you better. I drove back to Stonehaven alone. Maggie had offered to follow me, but I told her I needed the 20 minutes on the road to myself to put things back in the right order inside my head before I walked through the front door and sat across the dinner table from the people who had spent my name like a line of credit they had never applied for. The back roads through Westchester in November have a particular quality at dusk. The bare oak trees standing black against a sky that cannot decide between gray and dark blue. The old stone walls running along property lines of farms that have been here since before the Revolution. Eleanor had loved this drive. She used to ask me to take the long way home even when we were tired, just to see the light in those windows. I pulled into Stonehaven's gravel drive at 6:15. The house was lit from every window, warm and bright in the November dark. From the outside, it looked exactly like what it was supposed to be. A family home full of people who belonged there. I sat in the car for 90 seconds, breathed. Then I got out. Rachel was in the kitchen stirring something on the stove with a dish towel over her shoulder. She looked up when I entered, and I could see the small, reflexive assessment move across her face, checking my expression the way she had checked it all week, looking for signs of what I knew. I gave her nothing to find. "Something smells good," I said. I hung my coat on Eleanor's hook and sat down at the kitchen table the way I had sat there 10,000 times before. "Chicken soup," Rachel said. "Linda's recipe." I folded my hands on the table, let a moment pass. Then I said carefully and without inflection, as if the thought had arrived on its own, "Maybe you were right, Rachel." The spoon stopped moving entirely. She turned to look at me. I had expected relief or guarded calculation. What I saw instead was something more complicated, a flicker of hope moving through a face that had learned to be careful about showing hope too quickly. It made my chest hurt in a way I had not anticipated. "About what?" Her voice was very controlled. "Stonehaven," I said. "About it needing a future bigger than what I can manage alone. I'm not young. If there's a real plan, I'm willing to listen." The dish towel slipped off her shoulder. She caught it automatically, her hands moving without her attention, because her attention was entirely on me, trying to read something in my face that I was not putting there. Her hand was not quite steady when she picked up the spoon again. "I'll tell Derek," she said. Almost normal. Almost. I said goodnight after dinner and went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, listening to the sounds below Derek's voice, then Rachel's, then Derek's again, faster. The cadence of two people recalibrating their plans. At 9:47, Derek's voice came through the hallway outside the guest room, low and quick, with the energy of a man who thinks something has just gone his way. "She talked to him. He's coming around. We just need the real signature this time, Dad. One clean document, and it's done." A pause. "If we move the dinner up to this weekend, we can have everything in place before he has time to change his mind." I closed my door without a sound. I sat back on the edge of the bed and pressed both hands against my knees. I felt the tremor in them, not weakness, not fear, but the physical cost of holding still when every instinct was telling me to move. 20 years of building had taught me that the most critical moment in any structure was not the foundation and not the final stone. It was the moment before the keystone went in, when everything was in tension and the whole arch depended on nothing shifting. This was that moment. I called Maggie at 10:15. "I'm holding," I said. "That's enough for tonight." A pause. "One more thing. I want to be there Saturday, in the house, with Diane and the process server before you sit down at that table." "Where?" "In the front room off the hall. Close enough?" Her voice was level. "You say the word, and I walk in." "Come at 6:30, I said. "Before anyone else is downstairs." Maggie said something she almost never said. "Walter, Eleanor would be proud of how you've handled this." My throat closed around whatever I might have said. I swallowed once. "Good night, Maggie." I did not sleep. I lay in the dark and thought about my daughter's face when I said I was willing to listen, that complicated, careful brightness. The hope she had tried to conceal. I thought about the girl who used to fall asleep in my drafting room. I thought about the woman who had sent an email in April saying her father would not fight them if they framed it as his legacy. Both of those people were the same person. And on Saturday night, I was going to have to sit across a dinner table from her and let her believe for as long as it took that she had won. I pressed one hand against the empty side of the bed. "I know what you'd say, Elle," I said to the dark room. "Stop waiting. Stop letting them mistake your patience for permission." The oak trees moved against the window in the November wind. I watched them until my eyes closed. They had set the table without asking me. I came downstairs at 6:45 to find the dining room transformed in the way that rooms are transformed when people who do not live in them decide to make them their own. The long walnut table Eleanor and I had ordered from a craftsman in Vermont 30 years ago had been extended with the 2 leaves I kept in the basement, stretched now from one end of the room to the other and covered in white linen I had never seen before. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight. Silver cutlery that was not mine had been arranged with precise, practiced care, and at every adult seat, a navy folder thick with the Stonehaven Ridge Hospitality logo embossed in gold on the cover. I stood in the doorway and looked at it for a moment. The room smelled of candle wax and pine boughs someone had cut from the tree line at the edge of the property and arranged in a vase on the sideboard. Above the sideboard hung Eleanor's photograph, the one I had taken on our 20th anniversary, her standing at the orchard gate, with one hand shading her eyes and laughing at something I had said. They had left it there. I was not sure whether that was oversight or strategy. Pastor James Whitfield found me in the doorway. He was 63, the minister of the Episcopal Church in the village 2 miles down the road, and he had presided over Eleanor's funeral 3 years ago with the quiet, unhurried grace of a man who understood that some silences needed company rather than filling. Rachel had called him that morning and asked if he would say grace before dinner. He had driven over in his good coat. "Walter?" He shook my hand. "This is a lovely gathering. It is something," I agreed. He looked at me with the careful attention of a pastor who has learned to read rooms. "Are you all right?" I smiled at him. "I will be," I said, "by the end of the evening." He accepted that without pressing further, which was one of the things I had always appreciated about Pastor Whitfield. He understood that some answers required the event to unfold before they could be given. By 7 o'clock, 22 people had taken their seats. I watched them from my place at the head of the table, the traditional seat, the one Richard had carefully not claimed, because claiming it would have made his intentions too visible too soon. He sat to my left instead, at the corner from which position he could see both me and Derek, who sat midway down the table with Rachel beside him, their shoulders almost touching. Sophie was not there. I had arranged with Judith, a neighbor whose property ran along the eastern edge of Stonehaven, and who had known Eleanor well enough to be trusted with the children, to take them through dinner in the kitchen. Whatever was about to happen belonged to the adults who had signed documents and written checks. It did not belong to a 14-year-old girl who had done nothing except write 8 names on a piece of notebook paper, because her sense of fairness had overruled her sense of self-preservation. Brandon Collins sat near the far end of the table, his phone face down beside his water glass. He had set it face down himself deliberately when he sat. I noticed that. Pastor Whitfield stood at his seat and bowed his head, and the table settled into the particular attentive quiet of people performing reverence whether or not they felt it. "Lord Hum," Pastor Whitfield said, "we are grateful for this table for the hands that built this house, and for the people gathered here tonight. May what is spoken here be true, and may what is decided here be just. Amen. A murmur of amens moved around the table. Derek said it a beat too late. Richard said it with the resonant confidence of a man who believed God was broadly in agreement with his business plans. Then Richard stood up. He was 67 years old, and he had the build of a man who had spent 40 years in sales-wide shoulders, a handshake, designed to convey both strength and warmth, a voice that had been calibrated over decades to land in the back row of whatever room he was in. He lifted his champagne glass, and he looked around the table with the expression of a man surveying something he has built or believes he is about to own. "Before we eat," he said, "I want to take a moment to acknowledge what tonight represents." He turned to me, and his smile was warm and genuine-looking, in the way that very skilled salesmen's smiles always are. You had to know the context to understand what it was covering. "Walter, you have opened your extraordinary home to our family, and that generosity reflects the kind of man you are." He paused for effect, the timing of a man who knew how to work a room. 20 years from now, when Stonehaven Ridge is one of the most sought-after destination experiences on the East Coast, people will look back at this dinner as the night it all began. He raised his glass higher. His eyes swept the table, 22 faces, most of them lit with the particular brightness of people who have invested money and are waiting to feel confirmed in that decision. "To Stonehaven Ridge hospitality," Richard said. "To our $8.6 million future." Glasses lifted around the table. Crystal touched crystal. The sound was bright and clean in the candlelit room. I did not lift my glass. I sat with both hands in my lap, and I looked down the length of the table at 22 people drinking to a future that did not legally exist, and I felt something move through me that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but lived in the particular territory between them where the truth tends to settle when it has waited long enough. Rachel turned to me then. She reached into the folder in front of her and removed a single document, one-page heavy cream paper, the kind used for documents that are meant to convey significance. She placed it in front of me with both hands, the way you place something fragile, and she slid it across the white linen until it rested squarely before me. She pointed to the last line. Her finger did not shake. She had been preparing for this moment. "It's just symbolic, Dad," she said, and her voice was soft and careful, the voice she had used when she was young and wanted something and had learned that softness worked better than demand with me. "Sign here and everything is complete." I looked at the document. My name was printed at the bottom in clean type with a signature line beneath it and a date field beside it. Above my name were Derek's and Rachel's signatures already inked. Above theirs was Richard's, bold and confident, the signature of a man who had sold 3 dealerships and believed that momentum was its own form of authorization. I picked up the pen Rachel had placed beside the document. Derek looked at Richard. Richard's shoulders relaxed by a degree that was nearly imperceptible. Brandon reached for his phone, then stopped himself. Left it face down. I held the pen above the paper. The room had not gone quiet. Exactly. People were still talking at the far ends of the table, still reaching for bread rolls and refilling glasses. But in the immediate vicinity of my chair, in the 4 or 5 seats closest to mine, a different quality of attention had gathered. The attention of people who knew something was about to happen and were watching to see which direction it would fall. I set the pen down. The small sound of it touching the white linen was very clear. "Before I sign," I said, and my voice came out steady and unhurried, the voice I had used for 40 years when I was presenting a building design to a client and needed them to understand that what came next required their full attention. I have one request. Richard's champagne glass was still raised, slightly suspended in the moment between his toast and the completion of it. Rachel's hand was still resting on the edge of the table near the document. Derek had leaned forward almost imperceptibly, his weight shifting toward me the way a man shifts when he thinks he is about to receive something. I looked around the table, took my time. To everyone in this room who has invested money in Stonehaven Ridge hospitality, I said, please take out your investment folder and open it to page 17. The sound of 20 folders opening at once was something I had not anticipated. A soft, collective rustle that moved around the table like a wave paper against paper, the sound of people doing what they were told, because they did not yet understand why they were being asked. Rachel's hands pressed flat against the white linen on either side of her folder. She did not open it. Derek reached for his water glass and set it back down without drinking. Richard's champagne glass was still raised by an inch, suspended in the moment, between his toast and whatever came next. And he was watching me with an expression that had shifted from warmth to calculation so smoothly that someone who did not know what to look for would have missed the transition entirely. I had been watching for it for 10 days. A man at the far end of the table, heavy-set mid-50s, the kind of face that belonged to someone who had spent his career being trusted because he looked trustworthy, found page 17 first. I could tell because his reading slowed. His eyes moved back to the top of the section and started again. Mr. Bennett. I kept my voice level and unhurried the way I kept it when I was presenting a structural design and needed the room to follow the logic rather than react to it. Would you read aloud the second paragraph of page 17? The heavy-set man looked up at me. His name was Gerald, and he had put in $250,000 because Richard had told him over golf in September that the landowner had already committed in principle, and the paperwork was a formality. He cleared his throat. Ownership of the property. He read his voice, careful and slightly halting, the way voices become when the reader is processing the meaning of what they are saying at the same time as saying it. Designated as Stonehaven Estate, comprising approximately 82 acres in Westchester County, New York, remains solely vested in Walter James Bennett as of the date of this memorandum. Any transfer encumbrance or development authorization with respect to the property shall be effective only upon Mr. Bennett's execution of a conforming transfer instrument, pursuant to New York Estates Powers and Trusts Law, Section 7-1.17. Gerald looked up from the page. Around the table, the quality of attention changed. It was not loud. It was the opposite of loud, a sharpening, a drawing in, the sound of 22 people recalibrating simultaneously. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and removed a folded document. I unfolded it and placed it on the white linen in front of me, the property deed for Stonehaven registered in Westchester County, with my name as sole owner and the date of original registration in the spring of 1987. Stonehaven belongs to me, I said. I have not transferred it to Rachel, not to Derek, not to any company, not yet and not ever without my signature on a document I have chosen to sign. Richard set his champagne glass down. The small sound it made against the linen was very deliberate. Walter, he said, and his voice had not lost its warmth. Yet he was still working, the room still calculating. You agreed in principle. At the harvest dinner last May, you said this property needed new income. You said, I said the back refrigeration unit needed replacing, I said. I also said the south fence line needed work. Neither statement transferred ownership of anything. A woman 3 seats down from Gerald said, I was told you had already approved the project. Her voice was not angry yet. It was the voice of someone checking a fact they had been confident about, and are now less confident about. Richard told us, what Richard told you, I said, is something I'd like to address in a moment. I reached into my jacket again and removed a second document. The forensic analysis that Margaret's examiner had completed 4 days ago, printed on letterhead with the examiner's credentials listed in the header. I placed it beside the deed. Skjanters. The authorization letter in your folders contains my signature, I said. It is not a signature I wrote. It was copied from a roofing contract I signed in 2022 when I had the east side of this house repaired after a bad winter. The forensic analysis in front of me confirms that both signatures are digitally identical, not similar identical, because one was reproduced from the other. Rachel made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when something they have been holding very tightly suddenly requires more strength than they have left. Derek pushed back from the table slightly, the legs of his chair making a short scrape against the floor. Walter, if there's been a clerical error with the... Derek! I looked at him directly. On the date that authorization letter was supposedly signed, the 14th of August, I was at Westchester Medical Center receiving a cortisone injection in my right hand. Hospital records placed me there from 10 in the morning until 1:15 in the afternoon. I paused. Let that land. Then, you drove me there. You sat in the waiting room for 2 hours and 10 minutes. You knew exactly where I was, and you knew exactly where I was not. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the sound of 22 people understanding something. At the same time, the understanding moving through the room like a current through water, invisible, but felt by everyone it touched. Derek's jaw tightened. Something shifted behind his eyes, the calculation of a man who has just watched one exit close and is already looking for another. He straightened in his chair. He looked around the table at the investors, at Gerald, at the woman 3 seats down, at the older couple near the window who had put in their retirement savings because Richard had sat across from them at their kitchen table and told them Walter Bennett's name was as good as a government bond. And then Derek did what I had told Maggie he might do. What she had prepared for. I want everyone here to understand something, he said, and his voice had changed. The tightness was gone, replaced with a careful, measured concern, the tone of a man who is reframing a situation rather than defending himself in one. My father-in-law is 68 years old. He lost his wife 3 years ago. He lives alone in a 1,200 square meter house, and he has been under significant stress for the past several months. He looked at me with an expression that was so perfectly calibrated between sympathy and sadness that I understood he had rehearsed it. Walter, I know this is hard, but you approved this project. We have records of conversations. Derek. Maggie Shaw's voice came from the doorway. Every head turned. She was standing at the entrance to the dining room in her navy wool coat briefcase in one hand, with Diane Holt beside her, and a young man I did not know standing one step behind them both. The young man was holding a sealed envelope in each hand. Derek's face went through 3 expressions in less than 2 seconds. Surprise, then recognition, then something that was not quite fear but lived next door to it. My name is Margaret Shaw, Maggie said to the room in the voice she used when she wanted everyone present to understand that what she was about to say was not a negotiation. I am Mr. Bennett's attorney of record. I am here tonight because my client requested a witness. She walked to the sideboard, set her briefcase down, and opened it. In September, Mr. Bennett underwent a comprehensive cognitive evaluation as part of his annual medical review. His physician found no impairment of any kind. She removed a document and placed it on the sideboard. More relevantly, the hospital records I mentioned, the check-in documentation, the nursing notes, and the parking validation from Westchester Medical Center on August 14th confirm that Mr. Bennett was present at that facility from 10:02 in the morning until 1:17 in the afternoon. She nodded to the young man with the envelopes. I had left the front door on the latch for exactly this purpose. He walked to Derek first. "Derek Collins." Derek stared at him. "Derek Collins!" the young man said again, not a question this time. And when Derek said yes, the word pulled out of him by some reflex older than his current situation, the young man placed the envelope in his hands. Then he walked to Richard. Richard Collins accepted his envelope the way a man accepts something he has been expecting for longer than he will admit. With a stillness that was different from calm, the stillness of someone who has been running a calculation in his head and has just arrived at the final number. Inside each envelope was the preservation order, the asset freeze notification for the Valley Trust escrow account, and the formal notice of a Martin Act complaint filed that morning with the New York Attorney General's office. Diane Holt connected her laptop to the portable projector she had carried in and aimed at the white wall beside the sideboard. A table appeared, clean, precise columns and rows, every number sourced and dated. "This is preliminary," Diane said in the flat, unhurried voice of someone for whom numbers were a language more reliable than any other. "But the direction is not in question." She advanced to the first column. "Total investor contributions $1,140,000. Transfers to Derek Collins' personal account, Chase Bank, $90,000. Richard Collins, consulting fees, no documentation, $80,000. Brandon Collins, marketing and digital services, $45,000. Rachel Collins, residential property deposit, West 79th Street, Manhattan, purchaser, listed individually, $120,000. The number hung on the white wall above the sideboard, in the candlelit dining room of the house Eleanor and I had built, and Rachel's hands, which had been pressing flat against the white linen since page 17, curled inward until her knuckles were white, and her arms were shaking. And a sound came out of her that was not a word and not a cry, but something between the two, the sound of a person who has been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time and has just been asked to hold it in public. Derek was still talking when I picked up the remote. He had pivoted from the capacity defense to something else, a narrative about preliminary documents and good faith planning, and a family vision that had simply moved faster than the paperwork. And his voice had found the persuasive middle register that I imagined had served him well in conference rooms and closing tables before a civil lawsuit ended his career. Several of the investors were watching him with the uncertain attention of people who want very badly to be given a reason to believe the simpler story. I pressed the button. The projector image shifted. Diane's spreadsheet disappeared. In its place came in the camera footage from my study, gray-toned high angle, the timestamp burning white in the lower right corner. 12:18 a.m. The room went completely still. On the screen, Richard Collins moved down the hallway with his phone flashlight aimed at the floor. He crossed into my study in 11 steps. He went directly without hesitation, without looking around, without trying any other drawer, to the third drawer on the left side of my desk. He opened it. He removed the roofing contract. He photographed it page by page, slowly, the flashlight steady in his hand. 11 minutes. Then he replaced the contract, closed the drawer, and left. The footage ran for 14 seconds after Richard exited, showing the empty study. The desk undisturbed, the drawer closed, as if nothing had happened. I stopped the playback. Nobody at the table made a sound. Not the investors. Not Linda Collins, who had her hand pressed over her mouth and was staring at the wall where her husband's image had just appeared. Not Brandon, who had gone the color of old paper and was looking at the tablecloth as though it had become very interesting. Richard himself sat with both hands flat on the linen and his eyes forward and his jaw set in the expression of a man who is calculating, still calculating, even now, even here, whether there is a version of this he can sell. There was not. Well, that footage was recorded in my home, I said. On my property, by equipment installed by a former law enforcement officer. It is legally obtained and has been copied to secure storage and transmitted to Margaret Shaw's office. I looked at Richard directly. It proves you entered my study without my knowledge. It proves you went to a specific drawer you knew about because I told you where it was. And it proves you photographed the signature that had appeared on a document you are currently holding in a sealed legal envelope. Richard's mouth opened. He closed it again. Then Derek stood up. His chair scraped back hard, and he pointed at Rachel and said, "She told me this property was hers to commit. She said it would pass to her. I built everything around what she told me." Rachel's head snapped toward him, and the grief that had been breaking across her face hardened into something angular and sharp. "Don't you dare!" she said, her voice cracking on the last word, and then steadying into something colder. "You designed every piece of this. You told me it was a formality. You told me Dad had already agreed in spirit. You signed the managing member documents. You put them in front of me." Derek turned to Richard. "Dad, you told me the investors were family. You told me this was a controlled round." Richard looked at his son with the expression of a man who has just been handed a bill he did not expect. "You told me Walter's authorization was handled. It was being handled. It was forged." Richard's voice came out low and furious and slightly incredulous, as though he had only now permitted himself to understand exactly what he had allowed himself to be part of. "Derek, you told me the paperwork was in order." "The paperwork was in order until Gerald stood up. His chair made a sound against the floor and every voice at the table stopped. He was not a dramatic man. He was the kind of man who had spent his career in rooms where things were built or bought or decided, and he had the particular stillness of someone who is done listening and has begun to speak. "I put in $250,000, he said. "Richard looked me in the eye at Westchester Hills Golf Club in September and told me Walter Bennett had committed this land. Those were his exact words. Walter Bennett has committed this land." He looked at Richard. "Was that true?" Richard said nothing. "Was it true?" Gerald asked again, and the second time his voice had the quality of a question that already knows its answer and is asking only for the record. I tapped my water glass once. The sound cut through the room cleanly. "Gerald, I said, Margaret Shaw and her team will meet with every investor individually beginning tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Please bring every document you received, the subscription agreement, any emails, any notes from conversations with Richard or Derek or Rachel. Bring all of it." I looked around the table at the older couple near the window, at the woman who had asked the first question, at the faces I recognized from Sophie's list, and the faces I did not. That applies to everyone here. Save everything. Do not delete anything. Do not discuss your investment with Derek, Richard, or Rachel before you have spoken with independent legal counsel. Then I looked at Derek and Richard. "As for the two of you," I said, "please do not leave Westchester County tonight." The investors left in stages. Some went quickly, gathering their navy folders and their coats without looking at Derek or Richard, moving through the front hall with the purposeful silence of people who have decided that the fastest path out of an embarrassing situation is a straight line to the door. Gerald shook my hand before he left. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Others stayed longer than I expected, not because they wanted to, but because the roads had begun to ice over, and Judith, a sensible woman, who had appeared from somewhere near the kitchen with a pot of decaf and a kind face, had quietly suggested that anyone driving more than 20 minutes should wait another hour. I was grateful for Judith. She had spent the evening doing what decent people do when the adults around them have made a mess. She had looked after the children and kept the coffee coming, and not once pretended that what was happening was normal. By 11 o'clock, the dining room was empty of everyone except family. Linda Collins sat at the end of the table with both hands wrapped around a mug she was not drinking from, staring at the middle distance with the expression of a woman who is replaying a series of decisions and identifying one by one the exact moment she should have asked a different question. Richard had gone outside 20 minutes ago and had not come back in. Through the dining room window, I could see the orange point of light that meant he was standing at the edge of the driveway in the cold, doing what men like Richard do when the room has turned against them, standing in the dark and deciding what the story would be tomorrow. Derek and Rachel were in the kitchen. I could hear their voices low tight, the specific cadence of two people who have stopped trying to present a unified front to the outside world and have begun the much older argument underneath it. I went to find Maggie. She was in the small sitting room off the front hall, her briefcase open on the ottoman, writing on her legal pad, with the focused efficiency of someone for whom the end of a dinner party is the beginning of the real work. She looked up when I came in. "The preservation order has been received by Valley Trust," she said. "The escrow account is frozen as of this afternoon. Derek and Richard cannot move those funds." "Rachel," Maggie set her pen down. "She is not named in the freeze order, but the condominium deposit is subject to a separate motion I filed this afternoon. The title company has been notified." She paused. "Walter, how are you holding up?" "I need to ask them to leave," I said. Maggie reached into her briefcase and removed a folded document. "This is the notice I prepared. It is based on the misconduct clause in the occupancy agreement Rachel and Derek signed when they moved in 14 months ago. Under New York law, when an occupant engages in conduct that causes material harm to the owner's property interests, which forging your signature on a land authorization document unambiguously, does the owner may terminate the occupancy arrangement with written notice. She held it out to me. "This is lawful. This is documented. And this is the right thing to do." I took the document, held it for a moment. Then I walked to the kitchen. Derek was standing at the counter with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the expression of a man conserving what remained of his dignity by refusing to let it show on his face. Rachel was at the kitchen table, both hands flat on the wood, staring at the grain the way she had stared at things when she was a little girl, working through something she could not yet articulate. I placed the notice on the table between them. Derek looked at it. "You're doing this tonight." "I am. We have children here, Walter. Sophie is asleep upstairs. Sophie will be informed in the morning gently by me," I said. "She will not be without a safe place. I have already made arrangements." I kept my voice even. "The notice gives you until Sunday evening to collect personal belongings. A neutral inventory will be conducted tomorrow. Anything that was here before you moved in stays. Anything you can document as yours, you may take." Derek's composure cracked down the middle. His voice came out louder than he intended, rough at the edges with something that had been building for days, weeks, maybe longer. "You would throw your own family out the night before Thanksgiving is even over. You planned a securities fraud presentation the night of Thanksgiving," I said. "I am giving you 3 days." He stared at me. His chest was heaving with the effort of containing something he did not have the standing to release. Then he picked up the notice and walked out of the kitchen, his footsteps heavy on the hall floor, the front door opening and closing behind him with a force that stopped just short of a slam. Rachel had not moved. She was still at the table, hands flat on the wood, and when I looked at her, I could see the trembling that had started in her shoulders and worked its way down her arms until her hands were shaking against the grain of the table she had eaten breakfast at every morning for 14 months. Stonehaven will be mine one day, she said. Her voice was very quiet. It was always going to be mine. I looked at my daughter. At the top of her head bent toward the table, at the shaking in her hands. That is exactly what went wrong, I said. You spent an inheritance before the person leaving it had died. She made a sound, low and broken, pulled up from somewhere deep, and pushed back from the table and walked past me toward the hall without lifting her head. I did not follow her. I stood in the kitchen for a moment in the house that Eleanor and I had built, listening to my daughter's footsteps in the hall. Then I heard them stop. I walked to the kitchen doorway and looked out. Rachel was standing in the center of the front hall. She had stopped moving. Her head was lifted, and she was looking at the photograph on the wall, Eleanor on our 20th anniversary, standing at the orchard gate with one hand shading her eyes and laughing at something she found genuinely funny about the world. Rachel stood there and looked at her mother for a long time. Her shoulders were still shaking. Both hands had come up to cover her face, and the sounds coming from behind them were the sounds of someone who has just arrived too late and too suddenly at an understanding they had been successfully avoiding for a very long time. I leaned against the kitchen doorframe and watched my daughter grieve something that was not Stonehaven. I did not go to her. I did not speak. But I did not look away either, because she deserved at least that to be seen. In the moment, she finally saw herself clearly without the version of reality Derek and Richard and her own ambition had been building around her for the better part of 2 years. After a while, the sounds quieted. Rachel lowered her hands. She did not look at me. She walked to the stairs and went up them slowly, one hand on the rail. I stood in the kitchen doorway until I heard her door close. Then I sat down at the table where Eleanor had eaten breakfast every morning of our life here, and I pressed both palms flat against the wood, the way I had pressed them against every surface in this house that needed to hold still, and I breathed. My phone rang at 12:17. Maggie. Rachel called me 20 minutes ago, she said without preamble. She wants to cooperate. She says she knows about a separate bank account Richard opened in New Jersey, one that Derek doesn't know exists. I looked at the kitchen window. Outside, the oak trees moved in the cold November wind. Tell her to come in tomorrow morning, I said. Alone. Rachel was already in Maggie's conference room when I arrived. She was sitting with both hands on the table, palms down, in the posture of someone who has made a decision and is holding on to it before anyone can talk them out of it. She was not wearing makeup, which I had not seen in years. Without it, she looked younger and older at the same time, younger because her face was bare and unguarded, older because whatever had happened behind her eyes between last night and this morning had left a mark that foundation could not have covered anyway. She did not look up when I walked in. She looked at Maggie. I want to show you something, she said, and slid her phone across the table. Richard sent this to me in September. Maggie picked up the phone, read, turned it so Diane Holt, sitting at the corner of the table with her laptop, could photograph the screen. Then she set it down and folded her hands. Tell me in your own words, Maggie said. Rachel's jaw worked for a moment. She pressed her lips together, and I could see the effort it took not to perform composure, but to find the version of the truth that was complete, rather than the version that was merely less damaging. Richard opened an account at a bank in Paramus, she said. New Jersey, before the LLC was formally filed. He needed someone to sign a document authorizing the account to operate under a business name. She stopped. He asked me. He said it was internal family paperwork. He said Derek knew about it. She stopped again, longer this time. Derek didn't know about it. Diane was typing. The sound of her keyboard was the only sound in the room for a moment. How much went through that account? Maggie asked. Approximately $280,000, Rachel said. From 3 investors, all of them introduced by Richard before the Valley Trust escrow was established. She took a breath that shook at the edges. He was collecting money before there was even a company to put it in. Maggie made a note. And you signed the authorization document? Yes. Did you understand at the time what you were signing? Rachel's hands pressed harder against the table. The knuckles of her right hand went white. I understood it was a bank account, she said. I did not ask enough questions. Her voice dropped on the last sentence in a way that made it clear she had asked herself those questions many times in the hours since midnight. I didn't ask enough questions about a lot of things. Maggie looked at me. I had been standing near the window since I came in, and I walked now to the table and pulled out the chair across from Rachel and sat down. She looked up at me for the first time. Her eyes were red and swollen and completely open in a way that Rachel's eyes were almost never open. She had learned early, as many children do, to keep what she felt at one remove from what she showed. What I saw now was the version of my daughter that existed before that habit formed. It made my chest ache in a way I had no name for. Rachel, I said, I need to ask you something directly. She nodded. Last night when you pushed that paper across the table, the signature page, I kept my voice even, not hard, not soft, even. Did you know the signature on the authorization letter was not something I had signed? The question sat in the room. Rachel's breathing changed. Her chest rose and fell once slowly, the breath of someone who has been carrying the weight of a specific answer and is deciding whether to set it down. I told myself it was a formality, she said. Her voice was very quiet. That you had agreed in spirit and the paperwork was catching up. She looked down at her hands. I told myself that every time I started to think too hard about it. A pause. Her throat moved. But yes. She looked back up at me and her eyes were wet and her hands were shaking, and she said it like a person pulling something out of themselves that has been stuck there for a long time. Yes, I knew. The room was quiet. I looked at my daughter, this woman who had been 4 years old when I poured the foundation of Stonehaven, who had grown up in the rooms I had designed, who had learned to read sitting at the kitchen table while Eleanor graded papers beside her. I stood up. I buttoned my jacket. I walked to the door. Walter? Rachel's voice broke on the single syllable of my name. I stopped, did not turn around. I'm sorry, she said. The words came out cracked and uneven, pulled up from somewhere that had clearly not had much practice releasing them. Not so you'll change anything. Not so you'll... Her voice gave out entirely for a moment. She steadied it. I'm just sorry. I stood at the door with my hand on the frame. I know, I said. Then I walked out into the hall, where the November light came through the window at the end of the corridor and fell in a pale rectangle on the floor. And I stood in it for a moment, with both hands at my sides and my eyes closed. Behind me through the closed door, I heard Maggie's voice begin again, calm, professional. The voice of the woman who understood that some truths needed a witness and some wounds needed documentation, and that it was possible in the right room to provide both at once. 3 days after Thanksgiving, Tom Gallagher showed up at Stonehaven with 2 boxes of donuts, and no particular reason, except that he was 71 years old and had learned a long time ago that the people worth knowing were the ones you showed up for without being asked. We sat on the back porch with coffee. The pond had a thin skin of ice at the edges. The oak trees stood bare and patient in the gray morning light, the way they had stood through every November Walter Bennett had ever seen from this property, and would stand through everyone that came after. Tom bit into a glazed donut and looked out at the water. You know what I keep thinking about? What? That bottle of wine. He chewed slowly. The Bordeaux. Richard opened it like it had been sitting there waiting for him. My chest tightened with the particular ache of a memory that has been spoiled in the keeping. Eleanor bought it the year we sold our first major commission together, I said. 1999. She put it in the back of the rack and said we were saving it for something. Did you ever figure out what we kept saying we would? I looked at the pond. We ran out of time to decide. Tom nodded slowly. He understood about running out of time. His wife Carol had died 4 years ago, 6 months before Eleanor. The two of us had spent the following year doing what men of a certain age and generation do when grief arrives. We had worked and fished and sat in each other's company without demanding that the silence account for itself. What Eleanor would have seen it earlier, I said. The whole thing. She would have noticed Derek's eyes moving over the property like an appraiser. She would have said something months ago. Tom shook his head. No, he said. Eleanor would have given Rachel every chance to come clean on her own. Same as you did. He looked at me over his coffee cup. You gave her the whole rope, Walter. What she did with it, that was her choice. I thought about Rachel in Maggie's conference room 3 days ago. The bare face, the shaking hands, the breath she took before she said yes, I knew. I thought about what it had cost her to say it, and what it would cost her going forward, and whether those two things were even close to proportional to what she had been willing to let happen to the people who had trusted Richard's promises. She's still my daughter, I said. I know. That doesn't change what she chose. I know that too. Tom set his coffee down on the porch rail. Both things can be true, Walter. That's the part nobody tells you about this kind of thing. The people who hurt you don't stop being who they were before they hurt you. You just have more information now. I looked at the bare oak trees, at the pond, at the stone workshop at the edge of the property that Derek had told me to sleep in, which now had a lock I had changed myself, and a sign on the door that I was in the process of making. Was any part of Derek's project actually right? I asked. The question surprised me even as I said it, but it had been sitting in me since Diane Holt's presentation. The uncomfortable recognition that some of the numbers about hospitality trends and aging infrastructure had been accurate. The farm does need new income. The equipment is old. The refrigeration system is 15 years past its useful life. Tom was quiet for a moment. Probably some of it, he said. A broken clock and all that. He picked up his coffee again. But being right about the problem doesn't make you right about the solution. And it definitely doesn't make you right to forge somebody's name to get there. My phone rang before I could answer. The number on the screen was from the New York Attorney General's office, an investigator named Dana Marsh, who had called twice in the past 2 days to coordinate document transfers with Maggie. I held up one finger to Tom and answered. Mr. Bennett, Dana said. I wanted to let you know that as of this morning, our office has formally opened a securities fraud investigation under the Martin Act. You should expect contact from our forensic team regarding the Valley Trust records and the New Jersey account by end of week. Thank you, I said. Set to one more thing. A brief pause. The New Jersey bank responded to our records request this morning. The account received $283,000 between April and June. Richard Collins made 11 withdrawals from that account between May and August. We're tracing where those funds went now. I thanked her and ended the call. Tom was watching me. AG's office. Formally opened, I said. He nodded once the nod of a former law enforcement officer who understands what it means when the state officially decides to pay attention. How long do you think it runs? Maggie says 8 to 12 months for a case this size. I looked at the oak trees again, the two Eleanor had planted herself the first spring we lived here, closest to the house, taller now than anything else on the property. Long enough? Tom picked up his second donut. You know what I keep coming back to, Tom said. What? That thing I said to you in the workshop, about Eleanor and patience. He bit into the donut and looked out at the pond. I've been thinking about it since. A patient man and a man who's been waiting are not the same thing. He set the donut down. You were waiting, Walter. There's a difference. I picked up my own coffee cup. It had gone cold while we talked, the way coffee does on November mornings when the conversation is worth more than the temperature. Tom, I said, thank you. For the cameras. For showing up. He waved one hand in the dismissive way he always waved away thanks, as if gratitude were a weather condition he was too experienced to be impressed by. You'd have done the same. I would have. We sat with that for a moment, two old men on a back porch in November, with cold coffee and a box of donuts, and the particular comfort of having been known long enough that neither of them needed to explain themselves to the other. Then my phone rang again. It was Maggie. Sophie's mother called from Connecticut, she said. She wants to discuss the weekend arrangement. Walter, Sophie is asking to stay at Stonehaven. She told her mother it's the only place she feels like herself right now. I looked out at the stone workshop at the edge of the property. At the door I had been meaning to put a sign on for 3 days. Tell her yes, I said. Tell her Sophie has a place here for as long as she needs one. Sophie arrived on a Friday afternoon in the first week of December, stepping out of a taxi at the end of the gravel drive, with a backpack on her shoulders and a sleeping bag under one arm, and the careful, slightly braced expression of someone who is not entirely sure of their welcome, even when they have been explicitly told they have one. I was standing at the front door. When she saw me, she stopped for just a moment, one beat, two, and then she walked faster, not running, but the kind of walking that is trying very hard not to run, and something in my chest that had been pulled tight for 2 weeks loosened by a degree I had not expected. Hi, Mr. Bennett, she said. Hi, Sophie, I said. Come in out of the cold. She followed me inside and stood in the front hall with her backpack still on, looking around at the house the way you look at a place you have left under difficult circumstances and are not sure will feel the same when you return. Eleanor's photograph was back on the wall where it belonged. The projector screen was gone. The navy folders were gone. The white linen was in the washing machine, and the walnut table was itself again just a table, the one a craftsman in Vermont had made for us 30 years ago, which had held 10,000 ordinary meals and one extraordinary disaster and was still standing. It looks like it did before, Sophie said. It does, I agreed. I took her backpack and carried it upstairs to the room she had used before, the one with the window that faced east and caught the early light. Then I brought her downstairs and out through the back of the house to the stone workshop, because I had been working on it all week, and I wanted her to see what it was becoming. I had cleared it properly. Now the old equipment moved to the barn, the floor swept, the windows cleaned, so the December light came through without filtering. Eleanor's table stood against the east wall under the window exactly where I had placed it the week before. It was a plain work table pine with paint stains on one corner from the year Eleanor had decided to try watercolors and discovered she was better at encouraging other people's art than making her own. I had put a lamp on it and a jar of pencils and nothing else. Sophie walked straight to it and put both hands on the surface, looked at the paint stains. This was hers, she said. She used it for years, I said. Grading papers mostly. before Stonehaven was finished, and she had a proper desk upstairs. She said she liked working where she could hear the property. Sophie sat down in the chair beside the table, looked out the window at the pond, at the bare oak trees, at the thin December sky. She looked very young sitting there and also somehow entirely at home, and both of those things were true at the same time. The way Tom had said two things could be. "Mr. Bennett," she said without turning from the window, "will my dad go to jail?" The question was direct in the way that children's questions are direct when they have been carrying them for a while and have finally decided the person they are asking can handle hearing it. "I don't know yet," I said. "The investigation is still in the early stages. Whatever happens," I waited until she turned to look at me. "You will not be without a safe place. I told you that before, and I am telling you again." Her jaw tightened. Her throat moved. She pulled the sleeves of her hoodie down over her hands, the same gesture I had seen that afternoon in this same building 2 weeks ago, when she had given me the folded piece of notebook paper and changed the direction of everything that followed. "My mom used to say," Sophie said quietly, "that home is the place that doesn't ask you to be someone else." She sounds like she was wise. She was okay. A pause. The ghost of something that was almost a smile. "I miss her." We stayed in the workshop for another hour. I showed Sophie what I was planning: the workbench along the north wall, the shelving for tools, the small wood stove I was going to install before January. She asked questions with the focused curiosity of someone who is genuinely interested rather than being polite, and I answered them, and the afternoon light moved across Eleanor's table, and the paint stains caught it differently as it shifted. At some point, Sophie picked up one of the pencils from the jar and began sketching on a piece of paper she found in her backpack. I did not ask what she was drawing. I went back to measuring the north wall, and we worked in the same space without needing to explain ourselves to each other, which is the particular ease of two people who have decided they can be trusted with each other's company. Later, when I was in the kitchen making dinner, I glanced out the window and saw that she had taped her sketch to the inside of the workshop window, visible from outside, facing out toward the pond and the oak trees. It was a drawing of the property, the house, the workshop, the pond with its skim of ice at the edges. The 2 oak trees Eleanor had planted closest to the house, taller than everything around them. At the bottom, in her small, careful handwriting, she had written one word: home. My eyes stung in a way I had not expected and did not try to prevent. That evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table and took out a piece of paper. I did not write to Maggie or to the AG's office or to any of the people whose phone numbers I had been collecting over the past 2 weeks. I wrote to Eleanor. A letter I would never send on paper, I would eventually fold and put somewhere I could find it later. The first line said, I think I finally understand what you meant when you said some things are worth protecting, even at the cost of everything else. 10 months is a long time and not a long time depending on what you are measuring it against. Against a 28-year marriage, 10 months is nothing. A single winter, a handful of seasons, the time it takes for an oak tree to put out one new ring of growth that no one will see for 100 years. Against the particular kind of waiting that comes with a legal investigation, the subpoenas and the document requests, and the forensic accountant's reports, and the prosecutor's calls that begin with, "We have a development," and end with, "We'll be in touch." 10 months is a very long time indeed. The final sentencing hearings were held in White Plains in the 3rd week of October. Richard Collins was sentenced first. He had been charged with wire fraud under federal statute, the New Jersey account. The 11 withdrawals, the investor communications that crossed state lines promising a development deal backed by land he had never controlled. His attorney entered a guilty plea in August. The judge sentenced him to 18 months in a federal correctional facility. followed by 2 years of supervised release, and ordered full restitution of the $283,000 that had passed through the Paramus account. Richard stood in the courtroom in a dark suit that fit him the way expensive suits fit men who have lost weight. They did not mean to lose, and he said the words the process required him to say. And when the judge read the sentence, his jaw moved once and then went still. I sat in the gallery and watched him and felt nothing dramatic, no satisfaction, no relief, not even the particular exhaustion of a long fight finally ending. Just the quiet recognition that a thing which had needed to happen had happened, and that the world had not reorganized itself around the fact the way it does in the stories people tell afterward. Derek was sentenced the following week. Conspiracy to commit securities fraud under the New York Martin Act. The judge noted Derek's partial cooperation in the final stage of the investigation and his secondary role in the scheme's design. 11 months in a county correctional program with work release followed by 2 years of probation. Permanent revocation of his eligibility to apply for a broker's license in the state of New York. Joint restitution responsibility for investor losses. His attorney had argued for leniency on the grounds that Derek had acted primarily on the belief that the family succession was settled and that Walter's authorization was forthcoming. The judge had listened to this argument with the patient attention of someone who has heard many arguments and found this one unpersuasive. The sentence stood. Brandon had received payment for work he believed to be legitimate marketing services. The court found no evidence he knew about the forged signature or the unauthorized use of the property deed. He received a fine and 2 years of probation. Rachel's hearing was last. She stood at the front of the courtroom in a gray dress, with her hands clasped in front of her, and her face composed in the particular way of someone who has decided that composure is the only thing left they can control. Her cooperation with the Attorney General's office, the New Jersey account, the documentation she had provided, the testimony she had given, had been acknowledged formally by the prosecutor. The judge sentenced her to 3 years of supervised probation, no custodial term, and joint restitution of the $120,000 from the condominium deposit. When the judge read her sentence, Rachel closed her eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Then she opened them and looked straight ahead, and I watched my daughter stand in a courtroom and accept the weight of what she had chosen. And I thought about the girl who had fallen asleep in my drafting room 30 years ago while I worked late. And I thought about the woman who had sent an email in April saying her father would not fight them if they framed it as his legacy. And I held both of those people in my mind at the same time, because that was the only honest way to hold her. Investors recovered 91 cents on every dollar contributed. It was not perfect. A retired teacher who had put in $25,000 did not feel fortunate because she received $22,750 back. But 91 cents was what the evidence and the cooperation and the frozen accounts and Diane Holt's spreadsheets had made possible. And possible was what we had to work with. Maggie and I sat in her office the afternoon after Rachel's hearing. She poured 2 small glasses of bourbon from the bottle she kept in her bottom drawer for occasions that did not fit any other category, and she set one in front of me and kept one for herself. "It's over," she said. "The legal part," I said. She looked at me over her glass. "Yes," she said. "The legal part." I drove home in the October light through the back roads of Westchester County, with the oak trees turning gold and rust, and the old stone walls running alongside the road the way they had run for 300 years, and I thought about what Maggie had not said, which was that the other part, the part that did not have statutes or sentencing guidelines or restitution orders, had no fixed endpoint and no guaranteed outcome and would require a different kind of patience than the kind I had spent the past 10 months practicing. When I got home, There was a letter on the kitchen table. Handwritten. Rachel's handwriting, the looping, slightly left-leaning script she had learned from Eleanor, who had taught penmanship the old way, with lined paper and deliberate practice. I sat down and opened it. It was not an apology exactly. Or not only an apology. It said I finally read page 17, Dad. All of it. I should have read it before I signed anything. I should have asked you, and then at the bottom, in smaller letters, as if she had almost not included it. The oak trees looked beautiful when I drove past last week. I'm glad they're still there. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it carefully along its original creases and held it in both hands for a moment. My phone rang. Maggie, I want to rewrite the succession plan, I said before she could speak. Revocable living trust, independent trustees, conservation easement on the orchard land. No single person controls Stonehaven through one signature. A pause. Not even me. A brief silence on the other end. Then, when do you want to start? Before Thanksgiving, I said. Tom was sitting on my back porch when I got home from the courthouse. He had let himself through the side gate the way he had been letting himself through that gate for 20 years. And he had found the spare key under the same loose stone by the back steps where it had lived since Eleanor put it there in 1993. And he had made coffee in my kitchen and carried 2 cups out to the porch and was sitting in the cold October air waiting for me, as if this were something we had arranged. We had not arranged it. He just knew. I sat down in the chair beside him and took the coffee he held out and wrapped both hands around the mug because the afternoon had turned cold in the way October afternoons turn cold in Westchester, suddenly without warning, as if the season has been waiting for you to stop paying attention. How'd she do? Tom asked. She stood up straight, I said. She looked at the judge when he read the sentence. She didn't cry. Tom nodded slowly. That's something. It is. We sat with the coffee going warm in our hands and looked out at the property, the pond, with the first faint skim of ice beginning at the edges. The oak trees turned gold and rust. The stone workshop with the new lock on the door and the fresh lumber I had stacked inside last weekend, waiting to become shelving. You know what Eleanor would say right now? Tom asked. Several things, I said. Most of them more useful than what I'm currently thinking. Tom almost smiled. You know what I keep thinking about? Tom asked. What? That drawing Sophie made. The one she taped to the workshop window. He turned his coffee cup slowly. Eleanor would have done exactly the same thing at 14. Put a name on something she loved and left it where people could see it. My throat tightened in the way it tightens when someone tells you something true about a person you miss. She never told me that, I said. She knew you'd get self-conscious about it. Tom set his coffee down on the porch rail. Walter, Rachel is going to have to build something from what's left. That's her work now, not yours. You can't do it for her. I know. Do you? I looked at the oak trees. At the 2 Eleanor had planted herself the first spring closest to the house, taller than everything around them now. I covered Rachel's early debts without making her account for every dollar, I said. I told myself I was her father, and that was what fathers did. I think I was also protecting myself from having to see the full picture of who she was becoming. Probably both, Tom said. Most things are both. I turned Rachel's letter over in my mind, the handwriting she had learned from Eleanor, the oak trees still there, page 17, finally read. It was not a complete accounting. It was a beginning of one. That was all it could be at this age, and demanding more would not make it arrive faster. My phone buzzed. A text from Maggie, 4 words, trust documents are ready. I had asked her to complete the revocable living trust and the conservation easement before Thanksgiving, and she had. Stonehaven would remain under my control as long as I was able to manage it. After that, 3 independent trustees would act together. No single person, no single signature, no single medical letter could transfer it. 60 acres of active orchard land would pass into a conservation easement that prohibited subdivision and large-scale resort development in perpetuity. The rest would follow in careful steps that I had planned over many evenings at the kitchen table with Eleanor's chair in its place by the reading window and the lamp on and the quiet of the property all around me. It was not a perfect plan. No plan for the future is perfect because the future has not agreed to follow it. But it was honest, and it was documented, and it could not be undone by one person deciding in advance that they already knew what it said. "Sophie's coming this weekend," I said. Tom's expression warmed the way it always warmed when Sophie came up in conversation. He had met her twice now, and had declared after the second meeting that she had Eleanor's way of looking at things directly and saying what she saw. "What are you two going to do?" "She wants to help install the wood stove in the workshop," I said. "She's been reading about it. She printed out 3 different installation guides and left them on the kitchen table with the relevant sections highlighted." Tom laughed a real laugh, the kind that comes from genuine surprise and pleasure combined. "Eleanor used to do that," he said. "Leave highlighted documents on the kitchen table when she wanted you to do something." "I know," I said. I noticed. We sat until the coffee was gone and the light had shifted from late afternoon to early evening, and the first stars were beginning to appear over the tree line to the east. Tom stood up eventually, the way old men stand up after sitting a while with effort and without complaint, and picked up his cup. "Walter," he said at the door, "you know what I think?" "What?" "I think Eleanor chose right when she married you." My chest filled with something that had no precise name and did not need one. "She chose right about most things," I said. Tom raised his empty coffee cup in a small salute. Then he went inside to rinse it at the sink, the way he always did, and let himself out the side gate. And I sat alone on the back porch of Stonehaven in the October dark, and listened to the property settle around me, the creak of the oak trees, the faint sound of the pond, the particular silence of 82 acres that had always known whose name was on the deed. The Thursday before Thanksgiving, I finished the sign for the workshop door. I had been making it since October, a small rectangle of oak from a branch that had come down in a September storm, sanded smooth the letters carved by hand with a set of chisels Eleanor had bought me for our 15th anniversary, and which I had not used seriously in years. The work had taken longer than I expected, because I kept stopping not from difficulty, but from the particular satisfaction of a task that does not need to be hurried. I hung it on the door at 8 in the morning, stepped back, and looked at it. Property of Walter Bennett. 4 words. Small letters. Exactly right. By noon, Tom Gallagher had arrived with his contribution to the meal, which was a sweet potato casserole his daughter had made, and which he accepted full credit for without apparent guilt. Sophie came down from the guest room, her room now, the one with the east-facing window, wearing the flannel shirt she had claimed from the lost and found box in the mudroom sometime in October, and which she had not returned. She had Eleanor's illustrated book of Appalachian wildflowers under her arm, the one she had carried out of the East Cottage the night Rachel and Derek left, and she set it on the kitchen table beside the window where the light was good, and opened it to a page she had marked with a folded piece of notebook paper. "I want to plant some of these in the spring," she said, turning the book so I could see. "Along the south side of the pond. Trillium, maybe, and wild columbine." I looked at the page. Eleanor had pressed a dried trillium between pages 42 and 43, sometime in the 1990s, and it was still there, flat and brown and precise, the way pressed flowers hold their shape long after the color is gone. Tiny Eleanor planted wild columbine along the fence line the first spring we lived here, I said. It comes back every year. Sophie's face did something quiet and warm at being given that information, as if she had just received something she had not known to ask for. The afternoon was ordinary in the way that only good days are ordinary, the kind of ordinary that you recognize as valuable only if you have recently experienced its opposite. Tom told a story about a Thanksgiving 30 years ago that involved a turkey, a fire extinguisher, and a misunderstanding that had never been fully resolved. Sophie laughed until she had to put her fork down. I laughed too genuinely for the first time in a year, and the sound of it in the kitchen surprised me a little. The way your own voice surprises you when you have not heard it doing something particular for a long time. After dinner, Sophie helped me carry the dishes in from the table, and then went to the workshop to work on a sketch she had been developing for 2 weeks. A landscape of the pond, in winter, the oak trees reflected in the ice. I stood at the kitchen sink and looked out the window at the light coming from the workshop, warm and yellow against the November dark, and thought about all the evenings Eleanor had stood at this same window, looking out at that same building when it was still my drafting room, and I was working late and she could see my light from the house. Some things outlast the people who made them. I dried my hands and went to the hall drawer and took out 2 things: the letter Rachel had sent in October, and the small photograph I had been carrying in my jacket pocket since the night I sat on the porch and told Eleanor's image that we had done good. I placed them both in the drawer and closed it. Then I put on my coat and walked out to the workshop. Sophie looked up from her sketch when I opened the door, a new one she had told me at dinner, different from the drawing she had taped to the workshop window in November. She had a smudge of graphite on her left wrist, and the focused, slightly distant expression of someone who is seeing something that is not entirely in the room. "How's it coming?" I asked. She turned the sketchbook so I could see. The pond, the trees, the thin winter sky, rendered in pencil with the particular patience of someone who has looked at something long enough to understand it. At the bottom corner of the page, very small, she had written a date. November 27th, 2025, and beneath that, even smaller, Stonehaven. Just the name. Nothing else needed. I looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then I looked at this 14-year-old girl sitting at Eleanor's table in the building. Derek Collins had told me to sleep in, drawing a picture of the property that a man with a champagne glass had once called our $8.6 million future. Stonehaven had never been their future. They had simply forgotten to ask the one question that would have told them so whether the 68-year-old man they wanted to move into the stone house was actually going to let them take it. The answer had always been no. It was no the morning I stood at the bedroom window and saw Eleanor's chair sitting in the rain. It was no the night the bank called, and I sat in the dark with the land deed in my hands. It was no. Every morning I smiled at Richard Collins over the breakfast table and said nothing that was true. And it was no now standing in the workshop that smelled of fresh sawdust and lamp oil and the ghost of 30 years of work watching a 14-year-old girl draw a picture of home on a piece of paper and sign it with the name of the place that had always from the very first stone been mine. I pulled the door almost closed to keep the cold out, and left Sophie to her drawing. Outside, the oak trees stood against the November sky, bare and patient and deeply rooted, the way they always had, the way they always would. Looking back on everything that happened, I keep returning to one simple truth. Family stories, revenge situations do not announce themselves. They build quietly in small violations, in things people stop bothering to hide, when they believe you have nothing left to protect. I waited too long to act. I told myself patience was wisdom. Sometimes it is. But there is a difference between patience and permission, and I let too many lines be crossed before I drew one of my own. Do not be like me. Do not wait until someone is sleeping in your workshop before you decide your home belongs to you. I believe God places certain moments in our path, not to punish us, but to show us what we are still capable of becoming. My personal opinion in every family drama revenge story. The real turning point is never the confrontation at the dinner table. It is the quiet moment alone when one person decides they are worth protecting. That decision changes everything that follows. Stonehaven was never theirs. It just took me too long to say so out loud. If these family stories stories speak to something you have lived through, leave a comment, share this with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. A note: stories on this channel contain fictional elements crafted for reflection. If this content is not for you, step away freely, no hard feelings, and find what serves you better.